The more space you have for these guys is going to be the absolute best. So 40 breeder is absolutely minimum for a single adult. But of course, if you can provide a Hey guys, it's Colin and Jasmine. Welcome to the Tye-Dyed Iguana channel. Today's video is going to be all about bearded dragon husbandry and care. So, the bearded dragon, also known scientific name Pagona viticeps, or the central bearded dragon. These guys are native to Central Australia. They have a super wide territory across the central deserts of Australia. These guys are a medium-sized lizard. They attain a size of approximately 18 to 24 inches in total length, although some individuals are going to be more average, closer to around 18 to 20 inches. These guys, with proper care, can live anywhere from 10 to 15 years in captivity with really good care. And they're probably one of the most common pet lizards in the entire world for both their personality and their unique colors and patterns they're now bred into. I also just want to preface this video by saying, although there are many ways to take care of these animals, this is just the way we do things here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana. So, for enclosure size for a bearded dragon, we generally recommend starting babies out in a 40 breeder enclosure. This size is 36 inches by 18 inches by 16 inches tall. You can go with larger, but we recommend starting in a 40 breeder. And the reason for this is twofold. Number one, these guys are very, very active, especially when they're young. And they do achieve that, large size. So we want to start them in a large enclosure to prevent stunted growth. Starting them in a 10-gallon or a 20-gallon, it's just not very good for the animal. And overall, most animals that are started in these really small enclosure sizes tend to have long-term health issues like stunted growth. And the other thing is, as well, with the smaller enclosures, it's very hard to achieve what we call a proper thermal gradient. We'll talk about that a little more when we get to lighting and heating, but the more space you have for these guys is going to be the absolute best. So 40 breeder is absolutely minimum for a single adult. But of course, if you can provide a 75-gallon tank or a 4x2x2 for an adult, that's going to be even better. So the next thing, let's talk about substrate. So you'll hear varying things about substrates, especially in regards to loose substrates. But here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana, what we recommend is a product called Desert Blend. So Desert Blend is made by Zilla. What it is, it's a coarse crushed walnut substrate. Of course, you'll always hear things about people say bearded dragons should never be kept on loose substrate, yada, 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 especially like on online groups. But in reality, the only substrate that's like 100% risk proof would be no substrate. But number one, that's not very natural. And then the second thing is, if you don't use any sort of substrate, it's very difficult to clean your enclosure. So things like reptile carpet, slate tile, things like that, they get messy really quick because these guys, they eat a lot, so they go to the bathroom, they poop a lot. So we recommend using a coarse walnut substrate called Desert Blend. And the reason for this is twofold. So number one, it's not as fine as like a calcium sand product. We also don't recommend using calcium sand on these guys because it's so sugary fine, especially on babies as well. Sometimes that small, fine calcium sand can get stuck on their eyes and things like that accidentally. But then the second thing is too, the walnut actually has a somewhat bitter taste. So if these guys inevitably do end up getting a little bit of it on their tongue or whatever when they're eating their bugs or their greens, they usually tend to just spit it back out. They don't end up eating it. Unlike some of those calcium substrates where if the dragon's not given the proper supplementation, sometimes they might lick a little bit of that substrate up. So we use Desert Blend. It's very easy to clean too. You sift it just like kitty litter. And then the second thing is too, it is a little bit more digestible than some of those calcium sand products. So if they do consume a little bit of it, 99% of the time it's usually passable. And one more thing while we're on the topic of impaction, generally as long as your reptile is otherwise healthy and hydrated, impaction risk from a loose substrate is super, super low. Generally animals that present with impaction, in most cases, also had previous underlying health conditions accompanying that. So let's talk about temperature and lighting for these guys. So as far as our temperatures for the enclosure, on a bearded dragon, we're gonna want a basking surface temperature of anywhere between 95 to 105, but we really usually have the basking spot right around 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's usually the sweet spot. Although these guys can tolerate warmer temperatures, keep in mind in a captive environment, there's not as much variability in their environment in a more controlled space. So shooting between 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the basking spot is gonna be absolutely right on target. And of course, when we're talking about that basking temperature, remember we're talking about the surface temperature on the basking site, not the ambient air temperature. Generally in your enclosure, your ambient air temperature, if you have a 95 to 100 degree basking spot, is gonna be somewhere in the low to mid 80s. We don't really care as much about ambient air temperature as we do surface temperature. And one more thing while we're on that topic, make sure your basking source is consolidated to one side of the enclosure. A very big mistake we typically see with new dragon owners is they want to put the lights right in the middle because the lights that way gets more coverage over the tank. But you want to make sure you have that heat source dedicated to one side of the tank. That way we can achieve that thermal gradient. So we want the animal to be able to get away from the heat if it needs it. These guys are really good at regulating their temperature, so if they do feel too warm, they're often going to move to that cool side of the tank. So just make sure your heat source is located to that one side of the tank. So let's talk about light bulbs for your animal. So for the bearded dragon, there's two primary heat sources we use. So the first would be an incandescent tight beam basking spot lamp. So that would be like our in-house brand reptile basking spot lamps. You want to make sure that it's not a like flood style lamp. These guys, we want a consolidated heat source on the ground. So make sure you get a tight beam basking lamp, and we'll talk about another type of bulb here in a second. The second type of heating device you could use on these guys, second best option is called a deep heat projector. So deep heat projector, you'll have to rate the wattage, of course, according to your enclosure size or use a nice digital thermostat. But deep heat projector produces infrared A and B. Long explanation, but it produces a shorter wave radiation that's a little bit more bioavailable into the tissues of the bearded dragon compared to something like a ceramic heat emitter, which produces infrared C, which is very long wave radiation. As far as UVB lamps with bearded dragons. So there are two types of acceptable UVB lamps for bearded dragons. So the first type, the most common type that we use here in the store on our animals, is called a mercury vapor lamp. So a mercury vapor lamp, it's also referred to as an all-in-one bulb. This is a lamp that produces UVA. So that's UVA, all UVA is visible light. UVB, which we can't see, that's that invisible radiation part of the spectrum the animals and we get from the sun. And then they also produce heat. So great option for these guys if you're looking for a simple bulb solution. Those lamps typically have an average lifespan of about anywhere from 9 to 12 months. So a mercury vapor lamp would be the first type of UVB bulb we would recommend. If you're looking for an all-in-one solution, that's a great option for you. Another thing is, of course, here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana, we offer free UVB testing with mercury vapor lamps. After they're about 6 or 7 months old, it is a good idea to have those regularly tested at about 2-month intervals just to make sure your UVI and your microwatt outputs are still satisfactory for your enclosure size. The second type of lamp we recommend for UV for bearded dragons would be our T5s. So T5s are a linear fluorescent tube lamp. These are great lamps because number one, they have a great color spectrum, but also they have a super duper consistent output as far as UVB life. So generally T5 high output specifically, you want T5HO. So T5 high output lamps are gonna be great for a linear fluorescent fixture for these guys. And then one thing with that, having said that, you wanna make sure you're getting the correct percentage of UV for a bearded dragon. So you're gonna wanna make sure if you buy a T5 high output, make sure there's several brands in the market, but they're basically completely comparable to each other. So if you go with Zoo Med or Arcadia, just make sure with Zoo Med you get a 10.0 or Arcadia has a 12% or a 14% lamp. So those are basically an identical lamp, but Zoo Med 10.0 is what we recommend here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana. It's a great lamp. They have about a 12-month lifespan with those guys. One thing about T5 high output lamps as well is, just remember that with those lamps, although they come in varying lengths, so they come in anywhere from lengths up to 12 inches up to 48 inches, keep in mind the UV output is highest at the center of the lamp. So generally what I recommend if you're using that type of lamp in addition to a tight beam basking bulb, you wanna make sure that your lamps kind of sits catty corner across the enclosure, and then your basking bulb sits approximately 50% across the distance from the lamp. That way the animal is receiving its basking heat at the exact highest point of where the UV is as well. It's very important with reptiles and especially bearded dragons that they're receiving heat at the same time they're receiving their UVB. So you can keep other UVB sources on the other side of the tank as well, but keep in mind you definitely want to have UV at the basking site primarily. So let's talk about humidity for these guys. So we know bearded dragons are drier species. They of course come from scrubby outcrops and desert areas. So these guys don't need a particularly high humidity level. In fact, these guys are generally gonna do fine in a humidity level anywhere between 30 to 50% humidity. For most people, that ends up being a similar humidity to the level in your house. While we're on the topic of humidity, a big common misconception, I don't think it's going around as much nowadays as it once was, but you do also want to provide these guys a water bowl. So years ago, there was a myth that permeated that basically said bearded dragons don't need a water bowl. It's completely untrue. Although they may not use their water bowl a ton, you definitely want to provide a fresh source of dechlorinated tap water in a bowl for these guys at all times. And you can also use products like our Zoo Med ReptiSafe to dechlorinate your tap water to make it totally safe for these guys to drink. As far as diet goes, bearded dragons, of course, are omnivorous, so they eat a mixture of both animal protein and plant material. So the bearded dragon diet is a little bit interesting because the diet shifts as the animal ages. So for young individuals, the diet's going to consist of approximately 70 to 80% insects and about 20 to 30% vegetable material, I should say. And then once they get to about that 12 to 14 month age, the diet's going to flip. So they're going to be about 70% plant and vegetable material and then about 30% protein. So great insect options for these guys. We love to use our banded crickets. So banded crickets, small dubia roaches, black soldier fly larvae, waxworms as a treat. They can all be great options. The staple diet we like to use as far as insects though is definitely going to be crickets and dubia roaches. Superworms, hornworms, things like that, they are excellent options as supplemental foods, but they should not be a staple part of the diet. The hornworms, it's not that they're bad, it's just they're mostly moisture. They don't have a super high protein content. And then the superworms, they can be a little bit fatty and a little bit addictive. So those guys should be only fed as a treat or more of a supplemental occasional food. But for your staple diet, as far as insects, banded crickets or dubia roaches, sized appropriately, of course, to your animal. You want to make sure that whatever prey size you choose, make sure it's something that can fit between the width of the space between their eyes. And that's a good gauge as to what size your animal is capable of eating. Now, as far as greens and vegetables go, we like to provide fresh salad every day. Your staple greens should be either collard, turnip, mustard, or dandelion. Now, any of those greens are going to be very fine. They're high in calcium and other antioxidants and nutrients. And as well, you're not going to run into the issues you run in with some of the other greens. We generally don't recommend feeding lettuces or anything like that. Reason being, people are like, oh, I throw iceberg lettuce in there. It's just like eating celery for us. It's mostly water and fiber. There's not a lot of nutrition in there. And so that's why we don't feed much lettuce. We only do dark leafy greens. While we're on the topic of leafy greens as well, I do want to bring up two other leafy greens people sometimes offer on a too heavy a basis. Those would be spinach and kale. So spinach and kale, they're high in calcium, but they're also really high in vitamin A, which in excessive amounts can be a little bit toxic for your reptiles. So if you ever feed spinach and kale, make sure it's very limited on a treat basis. Stick to those four main greens, collard, turnip, mustard, or dandelion, and you will be good to go. So as far as feeding is concerned, we like to provide bearded dragons with fresh salad every day. So even when they're a baby, although they may only pick at it or nibble at it, you still want to offer it every day. So all bearded dragons need to have access to fresh salad every single day, chopped accordingly according to their size. You know, babies have smaller pieces, adults can have some bigger chunks. And then as far as insects go, for babies that are under 2 months of age, we generally like to feed them about twice a day, as much as they can eat in about 10 minutes. And then above that age, generally they can be fed once a day, as much as they can eat in 10 minutes. Having said that, you do want to make sure if you're feeding lots of crickets and things like that, make sure you don't have an excessive amount of crickets in the enclosure still. So crickets, they can like chew or gnaw on your animal sometimes. So you do want to make sure there's not excessive crickets in the enclosure before you throw more crickets in there. That's one tip to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to food, we'll also need to be using some supplements on our bearded dragon's diet. So here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana, there's two primary supplements that we recommend. So there's a bunch on the market, but these are just the two that we recommend here in our store. So as far as calcium, we like to use Zoo Med calcium with D3. Of course, this calcium we like to use daily. So you'll hear varying things about this, but just here at the store, that's how we like to do things. Now you'll hear various things about vitamin D3, but Zoo Med's formula, its content is pretty darn low, so you're not really gonna have to run into too much of a risk of overdose on vitamin D3. And in fact, you know, most people tend to forget a day a week or so it's generally recommending calcium every day is gonna be a good way to go. Me personally, I like to dust any of my insects with the calcium. That's an easy way you're making sure the animal's getting it in the system. Some people also like to take their calcium sprinkled on the greens like Parmesan cheese. That can also be a good thing to do. The other supplement we like to offer is Herptivite. So Herptivite is a multivitamin for reptiles. Herptivite in particular has something in it called beta carotene. So long explanation, but because these guys are omnivorous and they're not primarily carnivores, we like to offer a multivitamin with beta carotene. The reason for that is these guys, the prevailing theory is that these guys can take beta carotene and then their body therefore converts it into retinol, also known as vitamin A. So because you're using beta carotene in the supplement instead of pure retinol, these guys, if there's an excess of the beta carotene, they can just excrete it out. It's not going to cause an overdose with them as far as the vitamin A. So Herptivite with beta carotene, As far as multivitamin, we recommend that 1 time a week. You can either sprinkle it on the greens if they like it that way, or you can dust it on your insects. As far as daily care goes, you'll want to spot clean the enclosure for any poop. So most bearded dragons, they go to the bathroom every day or every other day in general. So you'll want to take your sand sifter or your scooper and of course clean out any large fecal matter, solids, things like that. Other thing would be, I like to take all my bowls out every single day, wash them with soap and water, or use something like wipe-out disinfectant according to the directions, properly sanitize my bowls and dry them, and then bring them back. So fresh water at all times, fresh salad at all times, and I wanna make sure those bowls are nice and clean, just because it's hygienic. Just like we like to wash our dishes between meals, you wanna do the same thing for your pet. The other thing would be, I like to go through once a day, give a visual check on them, make sure they're looking okay. You don't have to necessarily take them out of the enclosure, but you do want to check on them, see how they're doing, observe feeding habits, especially if it's a young dragon, just to make sure they're eating well, not having any issues. Other than that in the enclosure, you know, occasionally, like once every couple of weeks, I like to double check my basking temperatures, make sure things are still good to go. And then just keep a reminder as far as your UVB lights and things like that. Just write it down in your calendar or put a note in your phone when I know these things are going to expire, and then having them checked regularly. So if you're in doubt, always bring it in. We have a free testing service here. I can check your bulbs with 4 different machines so that we can make sure it's still putting out the proper levels for your animal. By no means is this a definitive guide on bearded dragon care. It's just the way we do things here at the Tye-Dyed Iguana. If you do have any questions, be sure to stop in store or message us online. Guys, have a great day.